Welcome, everyone, and welcome to Amanda Scott, editor of Porterhouse Review. I am very excited to talk to Amanda today about this magazine, and we were just discussing pursuing a PhD in literature, so maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. But welcome to all of you. As always, if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat, and I will work them into the conversation with Amanda. So I'm really excited to learn all about Porterhouse Review, and I have to say right off the bat that I thought Porterhouse was like a reference to beer. And I'm wondering if other people make that mistake, because I went to the site today and I was like, no, I'm totally wrong. It is not like a reference to some like dark, earthy ale.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was one of the trickier things when we first rebranded and relaunched. And it's actually like something that I welcome. I love when people kind of confuse it with that, because it's always like a fun moment for me to sort of like explain the real origin story. And we actually, I think, took that tendency for people to mistake it or confuse it with beer or beer. We actually used that for some of our materials for AWP a few years ago.
Wow. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so it kind of, we sort of fed into the joke or leaned into it a bit, but yeah, it's actually, it's inspired by Katherine Anne Porter. So the Katherine Anne Porter Literary Center is connected to Texas State University, which is where Porterhouse Review is based. And it's a wonderful space. We invite all kinds of writers to give talks, workshops to take place there. And unfortunately, with the pandemic, we haven't been able to host as many events, but we really wanted to, when we launched Porterhouse Review, kind of think of some of the literary landmarks connected to the MFA program and the university, and the Porterhouse, which is what we call it, or the Cap House, was one of those spaces. And so we went with Porterhouse Review, kind of knowing that, the steak or the beer would probably be associated or mistaken for the name, but that's kind of the origin story of how Porterhouse Review emerged. And yeah, but food items are never a bad thing.
So were you around for the original founding? Are you one of the founders of the journal?
Yeah, so I kind of, I came in sort of after some of these planning items were already off the ground. So I actually wasn't part of the naming process, but I sort of learned more about how that process took place. And it was actually the idea of a student, and then the faculty and others who were part of the rebranding were really interested in that. And I came in kind of right after they had decided they wanted to rebrand, and that we had the financial backing from the department to do it. So, as with many literary journals tied to an institution or a department at a university, the budget is always an interesting conversation, and it can be pretty liminal and in flux at times. But we were fortunate to get quite a bit of money to relaunch. So we worked with a marketing company to build our site. They helped us think about, what our brand would look like, sort of how our website might look and feel, and really thinking about the kind of content we were interested in publishing. And so we were really happy in the end with how it turned out. But it was definitely my first experience sort of being part of, like, from the top down, the whole process of building a site for a literary journal. I've worked in tech before. I was a tech writer, and I was sort of used to some of those conversations about the back end of websites or UI and user experience concerns, but I'd never really been part of the process of building a site. So that was really cool. And I think it's shaped the way that I think about what I do as an editor, and how we sort of keep the journal going from that point on.
The site is really user friendly. It's going through it. I mean, it pulls you in, and it's very easy to navigate, which I really appreciate, because surprisingly many online magazines are not that easy to know, but it's just the categories are very clear, and it's all laid out in like a totally user-friendly way. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, thanks. There are definitely like little tweaks that we want to make, things that you always notice things. But yeah, they're a company that they'd worked with the Missouri Review actually.
Okay.
And if you look at the Missouri Review website, we realized that they had recently rebranded. And so we thought, well, if they worked with this company obviously understands the concerns of a literary journal, which is pretty unique compared to maybe other online spaces. And so we looked into them, and we were really happy with their vision. It kind of matched with ours. And yeah, they definitely, in our conversations, were bringing up a lot of accessibility concerns that we necessarily weren't keyed into. So I really appreciated that. They were kind of looking out for us in those ways.
So how would you describe the brand of Porterhouse Review? I think brand is sort of icky word in some senses, because it sounds very commercial and sort of like an ad agency, but I'm sure it's something that you think about, like what do you want your readers to immediately get from coming to the site? So how did you conceptualize the brand for the journal?
Yeah, I think, going back to Katherine Anne Porter as the sort of figurehead, the Cap House was her birthplace. So she grew up in that house for a while. And then we, as a university, gained access, acquired that space. And I think in thinking about her work, she does sort of explore a lot of complex issues. She explores stories that I think are globally interesting. And so I think for us, we're really interested, and we state this in our mission statement, in really uncovering complexities of experience, and in whatever way that means. And I think to some degree, every journal is always trying to create more space for representation. I think that's a big conversation we've been having in the lit community for years now. And at the same time, I think we want to feel like we're distinguishing ourselves and creating, different spaces for people. So I think that, over the last 2 years or so, we have received a lot more submissions from those who are outside of the US, who kind of occupy those identities. And I think that's really interesting. We're interested in featuring writers from the US, but also from elsewhere, more far out. And we're also interested in different forms. So we've gotten some pretty interesting poems that were pretty tricky to format and display on our site. So I think in terms of like our brand, even though it feels, I think when you look at it, just sort of like this classic, more subtle, like visual brand, I think in terms of the content that we feature, or the work and writing that we feature, we really are interested in the complicated, complexities within form, complexities within the way a narrative is unraveling, and how someone is driving that story, that poem, that essay forward. And I do think that comes through in a lot of our work. I don't think that a lot of it is neat or is expected in terms of where it ends up, or formally like what is happening in the piece of work. And we're definitely trying to work that into our blog as well. So we have a field notes blog, and we've been trying to rein it in terms of like, what are we doing in this blog? But we finally said, well, we don't really care, actually. We just want to feature interesting, writing, writing about craft, writing about just being a person in the world who happens to write. We had a piece that we featured about this writer who wanted to attend a residency in the US, who was from Cameroon, and he had to try 3 times to get a visa to finally be able to come here and attend this really prestigious residency. So it was this sort of journey about that process. And it was, he sort of talks about just what it's like to try to explain like a writing residency to someone who cares nothing about writing, who controls the visa process, you know, like I think that tension is really interesting. So yeah, I think complexity, messiness, sort of the inconclusiveness of life and experience is really what we're interested in.
So just to cover the basics, you publish fiction, nonfiction, poetry, interviews,
and reviews.
And then the field notes. And are you open to pitches in the field notes column?
Definitely. Yeah, we're open to pitches in the field notes section. And we also take pitches for reviews and interviews. So a lot of our interviews and reviews are done in-house. So students, the graduate students who work with our journal and those in the MFA program contribute, but we are always open to outside ideas, and we do get some really great stuff that way too. So I would say in the beginning, we had more student-driven or program-driven writing and material, and now we're featuring probably about 50-50 in terms of outside pitches and work, and then stuff that we do and produce in-house.
Oh, cool. And do you guys solicit work from writers, or is it all through the slush pile?
Yeah, occasionally we do. So we have some really great faculty in the MFA program, and you know, they sort of stay out of the way. They want the students to sort of have autonomy and drive the voice and the vision of the journal. But sometimes they'll have a really great idea for someone to solicit, and so we work with them occasionally, and sometimes students too. I'm the faculty advisor, and sometimes they'll come to me and say, "Hey, this might feel like a long shot, but is there a way that we could potentially get in touch with this person?" And we've definitely taken those student suggestions and, you know, reached out to someone, and they were usually delighted to hear from us. And we also have the fortune of being able to pay writers. So I think in the beginning, when Porterhouse Review was launching, that was something that with our budget, we really tried to think about how we could not only publish and have a great site, but also be able to pay writers for their work, which is, you know, understandably not always possible, but we wanted to make sure that if we could do it, we would try to do it. And we were able to, so.
That's great. So I also saw in the mission statement that you're looking for work that is complex and complexifies a human experience, but also that speaks to the social challenges of our time. So can you say more about that? And if somebody submits a beautifully written story, but it's just a love story, or it doesn't have necessarily like a socio-political component to it, would you say that's not quite right for Porterhouse Review, or does it all depend on how it's written and what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely more attuned to, you know, those social complexities, those cultural complexities. But I do think that our readers are generally pretty open to, you know, finding something that is surprising and that might like meet that sort of definition, but is maybe more subtle or quiet about it. And I think when we're having those conversations with our readers, you know, we encourage them to think about the mission statement. But if something is really interesting to them and they're just like, well, I love this, I don't know that we can or should do anything with it if it's quite right for us, but I'm going to maybe push it up to the fiction editor and see what they think. And so we always encourage that dialogue, and we often have, you know, roundtables with those section editors and their readers to talk about like sort of the contenders or sort of the wild submissions that are like really piquing someone's interest, but they don't want to quite say no to it because they think that there could be something there. So yeah, I think, you know, we try to be, I think, loyal to our mission, but we're always, there's room for diverging from that, definitely.
So how does your editorial process work? It sounds like there's student readers and they're part of the MFA program, or is that right?
Yeah. So so apart from the journal, there is a graduate class called Editing the Professional Publication, and I teach that course,
Oh, okay.
and students can enroll in that course, and they don't necessarily have to be on staff.
Mhm.
But as they're in that course, sometimes they will help as volunteer readers. And usually the pool of readers and volunteers does come from the program, but sometimes we do take outside readers, but generally
Mhm.
it is graduate run. And you know, they work with each of the respective section editors. There's a process that's pretty consistent, but a little bit different depending on what specifications we need for poetry or nonfiction or fiction. And then they kind of start their reading process. We usually have teams of readers working together so that every piece gets at least 2 reads. That's sort of a pledge that we made, and we try to keep up with that. And then we also, once we have some pieces that are contenders, we usually have some meetings about you know, those pieces, talking about them, voting on them. And then depending on what our publication schedule is like, we start to sort of envision what's possible and what we really want to feature. And unlike a lot of journals, we don't have issues. We publish ongoing throughout the year. We actually publish every other week. So we kind of, we sort of move between different items. So let's say this week we're publishing poetry, fiction, and nonfiction pieces. In 2 weeks, we're going to publish an interview, a review, and probably a blog piece, and then we'll sort of rotate on that basis. So we try to keep writing flowing and pushing new things out to our readers. So it can feel a little intense for the editors sometimes, because they don't really get a break. They get some breaks throughout the year, but I think we want our site and our journal to feel vibrant, and like there's something always happening. There's something fresh always appearing, you know, at least every 2 weeks.
And are you open for submissions year round, or is it just the academic schedule?
Yeah, so we try to have open submissions generally throughout the year. So we'll usually have submissions for fiction, poetry, and nonfiction open generally in the fall and the spring, and then a smaller period over the summer. And then pretty much year round, I would say we don't ever close our submissions for reviews or interviews in our Field Notes blog. So if you're interested in pitching, or if you have a draft of something, you can always fairly always be guaranteed that there will be open submissions for those genres.
Okay. So I have a question. I hear this a lot from older writers. I think they get a little nervous when they hear that the work is being screened by youngins in an MFA program. And so is there a process that kind of makes sure to look out for all kinds of voices across the age spectrum as well? Or maybe do you specifically want a younger audience? And how does that work? How do those kind of considerations go into the editorial process?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question. And part of the course that I teach, since many of the readers are in the course, it sort of feeds into a natural conversation or set of conversations about reading sample work and how to read, you know, how to sort of keep an open mind. And even though many of these graduate students are younger, they might be somewhere in their 20s, some of them are 30s or older. It can be quite a spectrum of ages. I actually feel like that's never really been an issue. But, you know, because I think you want to have those conversations. Generally, I have students read some samples. We talk about what they're noticing, what they're liking. And we also talk about how to take into account bios and cover letters that are submitted. So we, you know, some journals have different takes on how to read submissions. Some do a specifically blind submission reading process, and some take into account people's bios and cover letters. I think for us, it is important to let our readers see everything.
Mm.
because we are trying to take into account who we're publishing in terms of being more inclusive and really, keeping a pulse on that or keeping tabs on that. But also we don't, and this is also important for me personally, as someone who is also submitting work and doesn't want to feel tokenized, as someone who identifies as Latinx, even though my name may say otherwise. I think that it's important for us to also not try to lean superficially into a mission or this urge to be inclusive. I think it needs to feel organic. And so that is definitely something that we push and we, try to emphasize. And generally, I think students get it, you always wonder because some students come from pretty non-literary backgrounds. This is like their first venture into a program, even for some a workshop space. But generally, I think that those conversations we get to a space where they get it. And actually, I end up learning a lot from my students. They have a lot of great insights. And I think that's what I always prefer. To me, the ideal is for us to collaboratively create knowledge and find new insights. And so, but to answer your question, we definitely have training kind of involved, and we make sure that they're set up to be prepared for the reading process.
It's interesting to hear you say you do read the cover letter, and that is important because I'm always telling people the cover letter does not matter. Don't worry about it. Editors rarely read it.
Right.
So is there specific information that you would want to see people include in the cover letter?
Yeah, I think for us, it's definitely secondary to the work. But I think that it can be helpful sometimes to see, where our writers are from. If there are any interesting or unique identifiers, in terms of their background. I guess from my own experience, having a name like Amanda Scott may not on paper indicate that I'm someone who identifies, other than white. And so I think that sometimes in those cases, or in other cases generally, that can be really helpful for us. So again, it's secondary, but it can sort of lead to interesting insights, I think, about a piece after you read it, especially if it's fiction or a poem or even nonfiction. You just read this essay, and if you take a look at their bio, you might realize oh man, based on sort of what they've stated about themselves and where they've published, I think I'm sort of seeing this slightly in a different light, if it's helpful in that way.
So what are some difficult things about editing the magazine? If you can reveal some of what goes on behind the scenes, it obviously you enjoy it. Sounds like you enjoy it, and you have. I was impressed by the size of the staff too, which seems unusual for a lit mag. You have a really substantial advisory board and a lot of editors, and it sounds like there's a lot of support from the university. And there are student readers. So what are some things that come up for you that just make it really complicated at times?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the challenges of being kind of housed within an MFA program is we do have a staff that is changing. We do have turnover. Students graduate, and so we have to fill those positions. And I think this is something many journals have to work through. But I think while we have sort of a vision and a mission, I do think that sometimes when you get a new editor in, especially with certain sections in particular, there is an adjustment phase, to sort of thinking about, okay, what are they interested in doing and how can we accommodate that while also making sure that they understand kind of where to meet us as a journal. So I think that's definitely a challenge, just making sure that from year to year we're consistent. I also think one of the challenges that I think I touched on a little bit ago was just editors keeping up with the grind of the work, and as students, I always tell them, your classes, your writing come first. The journal is obviously important, but don't ever feel like you can't reach out to me or the other resources you have, we can step in and help. But I think that can be a challenge. It's a passion project for many of them. It's also unpaid volunteer work. So, they don't have to be there, but they love it. And usually we don't have any issues with that. But I do think like creating opportunities to socialize so that the work doesn't feel so isolated, we feel motivated and not overwhelmed, is definitely something that can be challenging, especially online. We've been doing so much over Zoom over the last year and a half that many of the editors haven't met each other in person.
Oh, wow.
And that creates a really bizarre dynamic where, you come into a space like this for a meeting and you're waving at each other and you kind of know each other and you've like sent a bunch of emails or you're seeing each other in Submittable, etc. But you haven't like hung out, know. I think that camaraderie,
right,
especially as writers, we love to talk, we love to just be around each other. Usually like that is an element that is sort of missing, and I wish it weren't the case, but we've tried to create opportunities to kind of get away from Zoom a bit, and that's been nice. But the Zoom world we're in is really bizarre still.
Sure, of course, yeah. Are all the editors in the same physical place, or is everybody in somewhere different?
Yeah, so most of them are probably based in San Marcos, where the university is, and then Austin, which is just down the road. So they do get together and they are able to see each other. But as a group, it can be tricky sometimes to organize like a staff meeting or just like something fun we're trying to do together,
And so for you, you're pursuing a PhD in fiction. You're also submitting and working on your own work, and teaching and doing the Lit Mag. So how do you keep your stamina going for the editing of the journal? Do you ever feel like, oh, this is like one more thing I need to get off my plate? Or do you just like, is it just part of the fold and you really enjoy it?
Yeah, I love Porterhouse Review. I think, since I've been with it essentially from its inception, I think I feel a real sweet spot for it. And when the day comes, I don't know when that day will come, when I step away, that's going to be really, really difficult. I mean, I think sometimes I let the journal take over what I'm supposed to be doing, especially if it's other work or the PhD, because I'm just so connected to it.
Yeah.
So for me, some things feel like work because, things like contracts or other tedious tasks aren't so fun. But I think the energy of the journal and what we're doing and seeing how invested everyone is in it just keeps me going and keeps me here, essentially. And it's also really new. It's only about 3 years old. And in that time, we've gotten some pretty great recognition for some of the work we've published. We were awarded the best debut magazine by CLMP last year, which was really cool, and a few other nominations. So I think even though to me those are secondary to just the work, it is nice to see that we are, people are seeing us. And I think just knowing that there's so much more potential and there's like a long road ahead for such a young journal is really exciting. I think we're still in this like phase where things feel exciting, feels like we can still experiment, and that's really awesome.
So back to the submitting writer, is it okay for a writer to resubmit given that there is the staff turnover? Because I've actually heard, I was surprised to learn from some editors that when there is this staff of MFA students and they rotate out, their new editors come in and it's actually totally fine to resubmit the same story because it will have different first readers looking at it. So is that something that you would feel okay with, or do you feel like that's generally a bad practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually haven't thought much about that because I don't know that we've had that happen too much. I think generally we prefer if someone has submitted a piece and it's been read and it ultimately isn't for us, I think we would generally encourage that writer to submit elsewhere, regardless of whether there's a new editor. I mean, maybe if you're resubmitting, you know, a year or two later and it's a radically different story, I think that might be a fair opportunity to take. But I think generally, if we're seeing it and we don't think it's right for us and it's not a radically different draft the next time that you submit, then you probably should just find another space that is a better fit for you.
Sure. Do you work with writers to edit their work?
Yeah, so I generally work more in an advisory capacity when it comes to that, but I will assist the genre editors if they want that help or if they need that help. But generally, they have been pretty fantastic about working with writers. So I think our fiction editors typically have been the ones who've worked the most with writers to tweak a few things, and probably our nonfiction editors as well. I think our poems, we generally, I don't know that we make too many suggestions based on what I've seen. I think we most of the time look for things that are really close or ready to go, maybe save for a few slight tweaks, if any. But yeah, we're definitely a journal that if we see potential in a piece and we really love it, but maybe there is something that we would like to change or at least suggest for changes in the conclusion, we'll probably make a note, but we're always open to making that a collaborative process. So I think our editors are pretty good about not mandating a change, but saying, hey, if we publish this, I have a suggestion or two about this one area, but let's have a conversation and see what we feel is best. And regardless of that, we would probably still love to publish this. So we definitely, and I think some writers too, once they have a piece accepted, there have been a few who have asked to edit a little bit more or to like make a change or two before something goes live, and we're always open to that as well if it feels like it'll enhance the piece.
But the piece should be pretty far along before.
Exactly.
So we have a question here, back to the subject of brand for the journal. Can you talk about what Porterhouse sees as its primary audience or market?
Yeah, I think, that's something we're probably still figuring out. We do have, I think, a lot of journals, if they're online, they have analytics, but we really try not to focus too much on that. I think like thinking about audience or people as data points is unsettling to me. So I think we really just look at, who is submitting to us, and we kind of have a good snapshot of who seems interested. I think we're generally open to a pretty broad audience, but I do think, surprisingly, we do get a pretty broad spectrum, and we do get a lot of writers who are a little bit older or more mature in their writing lives and careers, and that's actually really great to see. So I don't know what we're doing in terms of like how we're attracting certain subsects of the population. I think we kind of just do what feels visually interesting, and in terms of what we want to publish, we sort of I think market or promote in that direction, and then I think that just ends up attracting certain audiences, maybe more than others. But yeah, I don't know that we have a particular audience in mind. I think what we do want, and what we really are leaning into more, is making sure that we're publishing a pretty broad array of voices and backgrounds. So we actually did an audit recently, not to get bogged down in data, but we were inspired by the Vita count, which was launched a few years ago. And I think initially the Vita count was really taking into account breakdowns of gender in publishing. And at the time, many literary journals, especially more mainstream and prestigious, tended to skew more towards male writers. And over time, that count has evolved to take into account other markers of identity. And we wanted to do something like that with Porterhouse Review. We're only 3 years old, So we wanted to see, where are we and how are we doing? We have a pretty diverse staff. We're about 50-50 at the moment, split between writers who identify as white and writers who identify as people of color. And we also have writers on staff who are non-binary and who also identify as trans. And so we want our readership and the work we publish to start to reflect who we are as a staff more. And so we found that we are doing pretty well in terms of publishing cis women writers. And, that's a good starting place just to know where we are. But obviously we want to bring in more voices and more backgrounds and more experiences. So again, we're not making it a mandate exactly, but I think it's just helpful to know what's going on and who's submitting, who we're publishing in the end, and how we can use that information to, kind of more actively seek out other writers, other voices.
Sure. So we have a question here about submission fees.
Sure.
Do you charge submission fees? And can you talk about whether you think submission fees impact the submissions that come through?
Yeah, so that was something we talked about in the beginning with launching Porterhouse Review. I think the $3 general submission is pretty standard. And so we kind of keep with that. But we also wanted to make sure that when we hosted contests, we weren't overcharging. And so our very first contest, we only asked those who were interested in submitting to pay $5, which was a pretty small fee. And over time, that has fluctuated. I think the most we've ever charged was probably $10. And sometimes you see contests that can go up to like $25, $30. And we really wanted to make sure that we capped it at a certain level. We have budgetary concerns, but we also want to make sure that our journal is accessible to people who can, meet those payment requirements and not feel overwhelmed, especially with a contest. But we also try to host free submission periods. Usually they're about a week long. And so there's always a week-long window, and that goes for both general submissions and contest submissions. So we've sort of made it a rule and a policy recently that moving forward, we will always in any given submission period have free submissions. And I don't think, honestly, in terms of the impact on the submissions we get, I don't think that it really impacts the quality too much. I think sometimes it comes down to when a writer might be ready to submit a piece, I know for me, I tend to wait until the end of a submission period because life is just so crazy. But if I have that deadline of like October 15th, I know that I'm going to probably submit like October 14th or 15th before the window closes. So I do think sometimes that happens because we are usually on the last day, like flooded with, many submissions. And, but I think in our free submission period, we also get quite a few as well. But yeah, we find great stuff, I think, whether we're charging a fee at the time or we're not.
So it's great to hear that you're both an editor. You're on both sides of the coin. You're an editor behind the scenes of a journal, and you're also submitting your work to journals. So how has being an editor impacted your submissions process? Do you feel like you have like inside information that you use, or do you just like know intuitively that rejections don't mean anything? How does it how does that process work for you? What information have you taken from being an editor and applied to your submissions process?
Yeah, I think it's definitely made me more choosy about where I send my work. And I'm working on a novel, but I also write personal essays and fiction on the side. So I think that because I'm working on a larger project, I don't always have as much time to think about submissions, which has been good for me, actually. It's sort of reined in my process. So I usually take a pretty, I sort of move through a few journals that I'm interested in, and I sort of target those, and I really try to tailor my submissions there. And I think once I started doing that, especially over the last, I would say 4 years, I started to have more success, especially in flash fiction, which I have started writing a lot in the last probably 5 years. I think it sort of made a difference when I really cast a smaller net personally. And I really felt like I was understanding the vision of the journal and how my work might fit in with that journal. So I think in terms of our mission statement and the work we've published, those pieces sort of make sense for Porterhouse Review. And I think that's what I've learned is, everyone has a different strategy, but for me, I think I just feel better about the process when I actually want to see myself in that journal versus when I'm just submitting to, a whole batch at a time and I just want to land that piece wherever, which is also a fine strategy. I just personally have a different, I think, take on it.
And how have you found those magazines?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and I also look through the submittable discover feature, which is helpful for seeing what submissions are open at the time. And then I'm also just like poking around a lot. I have a lot of writer friends and sometimes we'll key each other into a new journal. Like I think there were 1 or 2 that were launched in the last year. Like Pipe Wrench is a new journal that I think is pretty interesting. And a few others that are newer that sort of embrace flash fiction. And I have friends that know I write flash fiction, so they've encouraged me to try to submit there. So I think it's a combination of like word of mouth, Twitter, because Twitter is very active in the lit community, and kind of just poking around submittable and duotrope.
Do you feel comfortable submitting to the brand new magazines? Sometimes I'm a little cautious because I don't know if they have staying power. I don't know what they're fully about.
Yeah, I think that probably for us, since we're still newer, granted not brand new, but still, we're 3 years old. I'm sure people have that question as well sometimes, which I think is fair. And I feel the same way. I think, maybe as a journal is launching, I think it's harder for me to gauge what that work is going to look like and how it's going to be presented. So I think I generally am interested in seeing what a first issue looks like, how the rollout is, how they seem to treat and celebrate their writers as well.
Yeah.
And I think for Porterhouse Review, that's definitely something that we encountered. For our first kind of launch, we did have a lot more solicited pieces and some submitted pieces as well. And I've talked to other editors who, in rolling out newer journals or just knowing how other journals kind of approached that, they found that to be true as well. Like needing the help sometimes of solicitations and that sort of credibility of those writers, trusting a new space to then kind of ease any anxieties other people have about submitting. So.
Okay, interesting. So you have contests yearly. What are the dates for those?
Yeah, so we've toyed with 2 different kinds of contest, I guess, structures. So typically we've run contests in the fall and then in the spring. And this last year we tried something a little different where we had separate contest periods for poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. So instead of just having one period where all 3 genres were open to submissions, we sort of opened them and closed them separately. So we started with fiction and then we went into nonfiction and then poetry. And we did that because we also wanted to make sure that we could keep general submissions open. So if the nonfiction contest was open at the time, we were still accepting general submissions for fiction and poetry. And that was an interesting experiment. I think there were some things we enjoyed about that, and then some things that we found to be kind of tricky. So I think we're moving back to our original model. And I think it's easier for readers and those submitting to keep up with, if there's just one long contest period,
Right.
and there's a period for general submissions. They can sort of pick and choose what they want to go after.
And do you bring in guest editors for the contest?
Yeah, so for the last, I think, 2 years, and the first year we didn't have judges as a new journal, but the last 2 years we definitely had some guest editors and judges, and some of them were sort of like cold asks, and then some of them were through connections we had and people we were, interested in working with again, who had visited the university and the MFA program. So yeah, those are really amazing opportunities. It's always great to just work with writers outside of the MFA program.
Right.
And yeah, those, even beyond those contest periods, like sometimes you sustain really cool connections and want to come back, or they want to like maybe work on a special project for the journal down the line. So we've had those conversations, which are really cool because everyone's busy.
Right.
So when someone's like, yeah, that was great, let me know if you want to work on this thing or want me to come back for this other cool idea, we're always like, well, that's rare and that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting with the solicitation piece, because I think sometimes writers feel like when they know work is being solicited from more established writers, they feel in some way like the system is rigged or they're never gonna get picked from the slush. But it's also interesting to hear you say from the perspective of an editor, and particularly from the point of view of a new journal, it actually helps other writers to have those solicited writers because it establishes more credibility for the magazine overall. So can you, it sounds like you were soliciting work at the beginning, and do you still, what is the balance between solicited work now and work that comes, from the submissions submittable?
Yeah, so I would say the majority of our work is definitely through reading submissions. We definitely don't rely on solicitations, and we only solicit when an editor is really interested in trying to solicit someone. So one of the things that we encourage our section editors to do is to take advantage of some of the money we do have for solicitations and for things that might require more compensation. And so we always sort of try to feature like maybe 1 or 2 people that they really, really love, because they want to create space in their sections for that work. But I would say that's probably, very minimal if it happens at all in some seasons. But yeah, we definitely are trying to just kind of look through our submittable submissions and really rely on that work. And that's where we discover, I think, the most interesting work is usually through that process than through solicitations, which are great. But
Yeah,
I think it's the discovery of someone you didn't know before.
absolutely.
Like that makes this all worth it.
Right. Right. And it actually helps writers because if it makes the magazine more credible and if it makes the magazine, win awards, then it's going to help the newer writer to be published in a magazine with that established credibility. So I can see it sort of from both sides, that you want the submissions from the slush, but you also want like the kind of more the prestige of a known name.
Right, definitely.
Yeah. Can you tell us about a piece that came through the I hate the word slush is so
Right.
I think writers have mixed feelings about that, but a slush piece that that you just felt like, yes, this is it. This is what we're about. I'm so excited to share this piece with the world. I still think about it all the time. Fiction, poetry, or nonfiction that sort of captures the ethos of your magazine.
Yeah, I think, one piece that comes to mind that we published in the last year, I think it was last fall or maybe earlier last year, but it actually won the Penn Dow Award for short fiction. And it was a piece that even before that happened, we were all sort of blown away by it. It was just like one of those pieces that had such a unique format, and it's an epistolary piece. And it, sometimes when someone is experimenting with form, it may not sort of achieve what it's sort of setting out to do. I think form can be tricky, especially when you're experimenting, because sometimes you compromise the substance for the form. And in this case, that just absolutely was not the case. It was just so vibrant. There was so much, it was, humorous. The voice was really wonderful. The story and the way that it unraveled through these exchanges was so great. And so that's definitely one that when I just think about Porterhouse Review, and when I was thinking about our fiction section at the time, Re Frankie just came to mind. And I love the title, like Re Frankie, reply or responding to this character Frankie. I just thought that was so cool. And
Yeah.
I think that is like quintessential Porterhouse Review, like towing the line of like a complex, weird structure or form, and like a complex and like non-linear story as well, unraveling. So Re Frankie definitely comes to mind.
So you mentioned you you're occasionally looking for readers outside the magazine, so outside the staff. So if people want to get more involved with the journal, is that something you're open to?
Yeah, definitely. I think, we kind of take a look at our reading periods and need based on sort of need. But if anyone is interested in getting in contact with the journal, we do have an email address. So I don't know if you'd like me to pass that along, but I'm happy to. And people can email us. It's just a standard editor email that I and my one of my other sort of collaborators on the team sort of manage. So sometimes we'll get queries through there. And so if people are interested in pitching or getting involved, they can certainly email us through that.
And that's just the email on the site, the contact submission?
I think it should be. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Great. So what is on the horizon for you guys? Just continuing as you are and continuing to grow?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we're looking into right now is the potential to create a podcast. So it's something that we've toyed with and we've been working through, but, I think podcasts are tricky because you can start one and then it can easily drop off if you don't have the team in place or the sort of the vision in place for keeping it going. And so I think if that's something we do pursue, it's probably going to be a little while before we launch it. We're still in let's talk about some ideas we have. Let's try to think about what the planning process would look like for that. And the other thing is that we have a staff that changes so much. So making sure that if we have a podcast, we probably want a podcast editor, someone who can always fulfill that role and kind of head up a small team of people to keep it going. So that's I think the newest development and what is hopefully on the horizon for us. So that
would it be? Would it be interviews with writers?
Yeah, so that's definitely something we're interested in. We're also interested in just having readings of the work we publish. So having writers, when they are ready to publish with us, also send an audio recording of themselves reading their work if they're comfortable and if they want to do that. So that might be a series where if people wanted to, listen to some of the work we've published, they could. Interviews is definitely an area we want to tap into. We've also talked about like roundtable style, just like chat, where there's like a topic and maybe it's sort of related to writing, but sometimes I think I prefer podcasts, like literary podcasts that kind of go in other directions, but they're still about writing or talk around writing. So I think we want to maybe kind of move in that direction of having a topic that can intersect with writing, but maybe writing is not in your face and it doesn't feel like a repeat of something we've all heard before.
Right. That sounds really cool. If you do it, I'd love to hear it.
Definitely, yeah.
I look forward to knowing what it'll be. Maybe like history topics or something kind of meandering.
Yeah, and that's the fun thing about the research process is we're kind of all listening to like podcasts right now and seeing what's out there. and trying to think of like, what is the weird, wonky thing that we could do?
Yeah.
Where can we come in and fill
Right.
in like a gap that
Right.
exists?
Right. That's great. Well, thank you so much. So people can find you on Twitter at Porterhouse Review.
Yeah, Porterhouse Lit. Yeah.
Porterhouse Lit. And do you guys have a Facebook page as well?
We do.
Okay.
We're on Facebook, Twitter, and we're also on Instagram. So
Oh, great.
you can find
Okay.
us on all
Okay.
those platforms.
And online, of course, porterhousereview.com. And you're open for submissions now.
We are. We're
Great.
open for submissions in multiple categories. So
Okay.
take a look and we'd love to see your work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Becky. And thank you everyone who was here today. It was really lovely to talk with you.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys, for coming out.